What if I told you you could play Pokémon Yellow on the Nintendo 64? And not just through some janky setup, I'm talking about an actual N64 cartridge you can plug in and play. And today I'm going to show you exactly how I did it step by step, and stick around because at the end I've got a surprise for you. You might not even need to make one yourself. Now let's go ahead and get into it. A few years back, I made a video showing how to turn a Super Game Boy into a dedicated Pokemon cartridge. That project involved a lot of soldering, it took forever, and honestly wasn't the most efficient way to do it. Then another creator, Below Average Gaming, released a video showing that you could make N64 carts of Game Boy games using emulation. Unlike his method, I went with a slightly different approach. He used a dedicated blank N64 flash cart, but that can be a little bit more expensive. Instead, I decided to reprogram an existing reproduction cart. This can bring the cost of making one of these down significantly. Now that got me thinking, what if I made a full Pokemon set for my collection to match my Super Nintendo versions? So today we're gonna try to make Pokemon Yellow for the Nintendo 64. Now, unlike the other method that uses a blank N64 flash card, I wanted to reprogram an existing reproduction cart. But there's a catch. Not all repro carts work for this. It must have the CIC 6102 security chip programmed onto it, which was standard for most N64 games, but not some of the bigger titles like Donkey Kong 64, Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, or Super Smash Bros. Now, one game that does have it is Resident Evil 2, and that's actually super easy to find as a reproduction online. So I grabbed an RE2 repro cart to use as the base. To get started, I disassembled the RE2 cartridge and pulled out the board, which I'll be reprogramming, but I wanted a better looking shell for this project, and I actually had a Donkey Kong 64 reproduction cart laying around, so I took the shell from that one. That left me with a nice yellow shell and the board I needed to build my very own Pokémon Yellow N64 cartridge. Now with the parts ready, I needed to get Pokémon Yellow onto the N64 cartridge. Now I'm going to leave it up to the viewer how to figure out how to obtain their own game file, but once you have it, the process is super simple. The Joey 64 N64 cartridge flasher allows us to drag and drop games directly onto the cartridge. No technical skills needed at all. And before proceeding, what I actually did was plug in the RE2 cart and deleted all of the game files so that way it was prepped for the new game. And before we can actually add the game to the cartridge, we do have to convert the Pokemon Yellow ROM to an N64 compatible format. To do that, we'll use the GB64 tool, which I will link to in the description. Now this tool lets you upload your Game Boy ROM files and convert them into N64 ROM files with the emulator built in. And there's actually a few different options that you can add, like adding the Game Boy DMG or Game Boy Color BIOS for the startup animation. Now once you are happy with your settings, hit convert and export your game file to your PC. Then again, using the Joey 64, simply drag and drop the game files onto your N64 reproduction board. No flashing is required, it works just like a USB drive. And in just a couple of minutes, we were completely done. Now we have to remove the label from the Donkey Kong shell and replace it with a custom Pokemon Yellow label. Reassemble the cartridge, and finally, it's time to test this thing. And there it is, Pokemon Yellow running on the N64. But there's a problem. Right after Professor Oak catches Pikachu, the game completely crashes, and there's actually no workaround for this whatsoever, which is super disappointing. And I probably should have seen this coming since the intro sequences had a bunch of issues with audio and video syncing. While it's unfortunate, this highlights one of the bigger limitations of emulating Game Boy games on the N64. That being said, this issue seems to be exclusive to Pokémon Yellow. Pokémon Red, Blue, Green, Gold, Silver, and Crystal all seem to work just fine, making Yellow the unfortunate outlier. More than anything, it's a cool project and a great conversation piece. That said, there are obviously some other limitations. Since there's no link cable support, you won't be able to trade Pokemon or battle other players, which means completing the Pokédex the traditional way is out of the question. That said, for games that do work, the controls actually feel really good, and honestly this is a fun way to replay some of those games on a bigger screen using original N64 hardware. Now here's the part that might surprise you. If you own an EverDrive for the N64, you can simply load these games onto it and then play them directly. You can also buy pre-made, pre-programmed versions of these carts from places like AliExpress or some independent sellers. And that includes buying the cartridge on its own or buying a complete in-box version as well. So yeah, the only thing that I'd say is maybe don't buy a Pokémon Yellow N64 cartridge unless you just want it as a really cool display piece. The only other downside is that sometimes the label quality on these things can be pretty hit or miss, and that's why I opted to replace all the labels with high quality ones from Etsy. So if you want a clean looking Pokemon N64 cart that works sometimes, that's something to keep in mind. Now, even though Pokemon Yellow for N64 was a complete failure, this was still a fun project to put together. Now I have a Pokemon set for both my Super Nintendo and Nintendo 64, as well as my original Game Boy, and it was a great learning experience. Now what do you guys think? Would you build one of these yourselves, or would you just grab a pre-made one? Would you not even bother? Is this kind of like a waste of time to you? I want to hear from you guys in the comments section down below. Now, as I mentioned, I will leave all necessary links in the description below, but that is pretty much all I've got for you guys in this video. Thank you so very much for watching. I'll speak to you guys again real soon.